Okay, so I haven't uploaded a video in a while, but I just wanted to kind of like make sure I had this right because this is absolutely like probably one of the hardest things to figure out about the whole Zelda timeline. And figuring out how Ocarina of Time really ends because there's a lot of stuff that happens at once, and sometimes you got to go back and make sure you really have it right. But there are some people to this day that still kind of get confused on like how the game ends. Probably the one part that a lot of people still bring up is how was the Door of Time still open when Link actually got sent back by adult Zelda? When she wanted to return him 7 years to his childhood. Now, at first, it kind of looks like she sends him back just before he grabs the Master Sword and picks up and just after he opens the Door of Time. But if you actually look at his arm, you'll notice how he doesn't have the bomb flower bracelets that the Gorons gave him to lift the bomb flowers. Just before he went into Gondo's Cavern, the second dungeon in the game, basically. But this was shortly after he would have got the letter from Zelda and had trotted his way up Death Mountain, found his way in there, and then found his way into, basically Death Mountain. But he wouldn't go into Death Mountain. Yeah, he'd go to Gondo's Cavern, which is just a little past the curb up the mountain slant. It's in the mountain, basically. So anyways, what happens is, Link goes back in time, and the timeline itself still exists. Now, I've mentioned before, probably one of the most confusing things about this whole thing was just basically trying to figure out what was erased and what wasn't. Ganondorf was obviously taken out of the equation, and he was moved to another dimension, from one dimension to the next. So what happens is Zelda sends him back and talks about how she just wants him to relive his timeline, his 7 years. However, though, Link actually took it upon himself to want to get out of the Temple of Time. Because keep in mind, if you don't know how this works, you have two barriers. You have the Master Sword's pedestal, which no evil can touch, but that has to be drawn from its pedestal in order for the Sacred Realm to truly be open. And then you have the Door of Time, which is basically the first one. But in order to open the Door of Time, you need the Ocarina of Time, the Song of Time, and the three medallions, or no, the three pendants. The Emerald, the Kokiri Emerald, the Goron's Ruby, and the Zora Sapphire, I believe. Yeah, but at the same time, though, there have been some people that have speculated maybe there's other ways to open it. People that have higher powers. Zelda could probably do it because if you remember when you're escaping Ganon's tower in the adult version, you might remember how she was able to open gates by herself. That's actually kind of interesting considering she is a goddess after all with the Triforce of Wisdom. So what powers does Zelda have that we don't see? That's a good question. I actually do think I wouldn't be surprised that the reason why the timeline kind of doesn't make sense to some people is because a lot of people kind of underestimate that. And this is kind of why I think Link was able to return back to his timeline the way he did. Because you think about it, how is it that the Door of Time was open before Link met Zelda for the very first time if that's exactly when Nintendo was implying that they originally met? And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because when Link goes back to Zelda to see Zelda for the first time, she already knows who he is, chances are, because she still has that prophecy. She was kind of predicting the future, that she was going to meet a boy in green who was from the forest, and she already knew who he was before he even introduced himself. So that kind of would have made sense that she had a feeling that she would meet him again. Maybe not under the same obligation, because she probably might not remember him exactly, but Link still remembers. Not to mention, here's something else that kind of makes it kind of gets confusing. The Door of Time how does the Door of Time really close? Well, I would actually argue it's a lot easier to close it than it is to open it, because if Link was just able to walk right past it and then it would close at some point, the keys would be missing, because maybe there was a special force that was holding it together and then eventually it just closed, because the spell would temporarily wear off. It didn't take Link that long to go back to his original timeline. It was just getting out of the Temple of Time that was the hard part. But once he was able to leave the Temple of Time, he probably took it upon himself that he still remembered what was going to happen, so he went over to Zelda, because you have the castle itself that's still around the gates, but the Temple of Time was built by the sages, and the Sacred Realm was in the castle yard. So basically, all Link had to do was go from the Temple of Time. He was in the market, then he had to head straight up into the castle, but he already knew how to get in there and get out because he did it before. So the guards were probably still just cruising around like they usually do, but Link knew how to get past them. And so that's where the game ends, because Zelda, Link, I think the other thing that a lot of people get confused on is how was Link's memory not erased when he was technically traveling through time. And the reason why was because it didn't really affect him. You could say because, Link is a god because he can time travel, but his memories still were intact because he didn't change his past, technically. He just went forward through time and destroyed a lot of things. Maybe Zelda cast a spell on him that sent him back to his original timeline, but she didn't erase his memory, though, because he knew what was going to happen next, and he was the only one that really could convince everybody, because that was what really happened at first. Zelda had the idea that something bad was going to happen, and she knew it was in Ganondorf, but nobody would believe her. But at that time when Link met her, Link didn't know what was going to happen, so he kind of had to figure it out. But then what she did was she sent him back in time, but now that Link saw everything, they were right back where they started, and Link had the memory. He could prove without a doubt what was going to happen, and so could Zelda. So maybe her father then believed her, and then that's why they executed Ganondorf just before they had that alliance at the audience chamber in Hyrule Castle. Why Zelda was spying through the glass just to be able to tell her father that, yes, Ganondorf is not the man you want to trust. And that is basically what happens in Ocarina of Time. And so it's actually worth noting that is probably why we have the many timelines that we do. Because Link, what Link would probably do is, after Ganondorf would go off to be executed, and then we'd see the Twilight Princess version of Ganondorf and all that getting executed. But what happened was, if you really think about how the timeline works and all that, Link probably went on another journey, and then that was obviously the same Link that went into Termina, the Legend of Zelda, Majora's Mask, for example. So that made a lot of sense to believe that too. So I think that is true, and it makes a lot more sense to believe that maybe Link was just going back and doing what he had to do, but he was just about to prepare for like the next journey instead of just living 7 years in the Kokiri forest where he originally was being raised, because he wasn't one of the children, but the children knew him as like a really good friend and all that. So the sages were saved in that timeline, but in the original timeline, or the 7-year timeline that he just came back from, still existed where they were dead. And it's actually worth noting they probably departed to the afterlife after the ending credits. The same time Link was just heading back to his timeline originally. So he saved everybody in the original timeline, but the parallel universe timeline where Wind Waker takes place, they needed more sages, and they had a different Link because Link wasn't, the original Ocarina of Time Link was no longer in that timeline. And if you want to argue the hero is dead timeline, once again, I wouldn't say the hero was dead. I would just say he just went off to another timeline. Maybe Ganondorf came back in that timeline, and then that was why he was able to do what he did. He came back in Wind Waker. He came back in A Link to the Past, and there was just so many things that happened. So it's really debatable what. How you want to word everything, but that's basically it. They're just trying to figure out like what to do next. So that would definitely explain a lot then. So again, if you have any questions or if you're confused about anything else, let me know. But that was just what happened to me, and hopefully we can find some more stuff and make videos about it so that way more people can catch on to it.